Okay, so let's jump right into it. This meeting between the presidents of the United States and Ukraine,
Yeah.
um, it's been all over the news.
Oh, absolutely.
And, people are saying it got a little heated.
A little bit heated, yeah.
We've all seen the headlines, but we're going deeper. We've got excerpts from the actual transcript of the meeting, and we're going to unpack what really happened.
This meeting really shows how complex international diplomacy can be. We're not just looking at a deal being made,
Right.
but we're seeing personalities and tensions, historical baggage. All of these things factor into these really high-stakes conversations.
Absolutely. And we can't forget the backdrop here, right? We're talking about an active war, a fight for survival,
Right.
and a lot of mistrust. It seems like the Ukrainian president maybe isn't fully convinced.
Yeah, you're right. There's a real urgency in his words.
Yeah.
He's emphasizing how dangerous things are right now with the ongoing threat from Russia.
So that's where I feel like the conversation starts to shift a little.
Yeah.
The U.S. president is talking about compromises. He's talking about achieving peace.
Right.
He even says at some point that he thinks he can strike a deal with Putin.
Yeah.
But the Ukrainian president seems very skeptical.
Well, you have to remember that we're talking about a leader who has seen firsthand how Putin operates. He's seen him break agreements
Of course.
and, annex Crimea back in 2014.
Right.
So, yeah, he's looking at a long history of broken promises. A ceasefire isn't enough for him.
Right.
He needs strong, reliable allies, not just words.
And that history seems to play a really big role in this whole exchange.
Absolutely.
I mean, the Ukrainian president brings up Crimea very specifically.
Yeah.
And that's really when things start to take a turn.
He's clearly frustrated with what he sees as past failures to stop Putin. It's like he's saying, we told you this would happen. We warned you back then and nobody listened.
Right.
And this is where you can really see the personal dynamic between these two leaders. You can just feel the tension rising as you read through the transcript. It's like the U.S. president wants to be seen as the one who is saving the day. But the Ukrainian president, he's focused on survival.
Of course he is.
He doesn't want compliments. He needs actual support.
And we have to remember, all of this is happening while a war is raging.
Absolutely.
Lives are being lost every day.
Yeah. It's a very sobering reminder of what's at stake here.
Right. This isn't just a political game.
No.
This is about people's lives, their homes, their country. And the Ukrainian president brought that human element into the room. He showed the U.S. president photos of Ukrainian prisoners of war. He highlighted the horrible conditions they're facing in those Russian prisons. It was a very visceral reminder of the human cost of this war.
Yeah, it was a very calculated move as well, I think, by appealing to the U.S. president's emotions.
Right.
He was trying to get past all the politics and really drive home the urgency of the situation.
But it's hard to say if it worked, because the U.S. president seemed to try and steer the conversation back towards that mineral deal.
He did.
Almost as if he wanted to change the subject a little bit.
Right, and he kept saying how confident he was in his ability to negotiate, that he could get Putin to the table.
Right.
He was really pushing this idea that he could end the war quickly.
But to the Ukrainian president, that probably just sounded like more empty promises.
Probably, yeah.
And then you've got the wider context to consider as well, right? The Ukrainian president kept emphasizing the need for a united front in Europe.
Yes.
With the U.S. taking the lead.
He's basically saying if Putin is successful in Ukraine, he's not going to stop there.
Right.
He even mentions the Baltic states and Poland as potential targets.
Wow.
This is a direct appeal to the U.S.'s commitment to NATO.
Right.
And to the security of its allies in Europe.
But the U.S. president has a bit of a history of questioning NATO's relevance.
He does.
And he's often pushed for European countries to take on more responsibility for their own defense.
This is part of a much larger debate within NATO about how much each country should contribute.
Right.
But in this situation, it probably sounded to the Ukrainian president like the U.S. was maybe hesitant to fully commit to defending Ukraine in the long term.
And that tension, that uncertainty about the U.S.'s commitment really hangs over the entire conversation.
It does. It's like they're speaking two different languages.
Yeah.
Operating on completely different timelines.
Right. The U.S. president, he wants this quick resolution.
He wants a deal he can point to and say, look, I succeeded. Yeah. But the Ukrainian president, what he really wants is long-term security for his country. Something that lasts longer than just a temporary ceasefire.
It's almost like the U.S. president is looking at this as a business transaction.
Yeah.
Get the minerals and the conflict and move on.
Right.
But for the Ukrainian president, this is an existential fight for survival.
Absolutely.
And that difference in perspective is really fundamental. He told the Ukrainian president that he should be more thankful for all the support that the U.S. is providing. He really felt like he was trying to put the Ukrainian president in his place.
Yeah, it was definitely about power.
Right.
And the Ukrainian president, he pushed back, of course.
Yeah.
He defended his country's stance.
Of course.
And reminded the U.S. president that it's the Ukrainians who are paying the price for this war, not the United States.
And I feel like the way the U.S. president kept interrupting.
Oh, yeah.
Talking over the Ukrainian president just added fuel to the fire.
Yeah, absolutely. It created this atmosphere of disrespect. Like he wasn't really listening to what the Ukrainian president was trying to say.
So where does this leave us? The relationship between these two leaders seems pretty damaged.
Yeah.
And I think that raises some serious questions about where this alliance goes from here.
Yeah, and what it means for peace in Ukraine. I mean, the whole world is watching this very closely.
They are.
This wasn't just some private argument. This was a very public display of tension between these two leaders.
So we've gone way beyond the headlines here.
We have.
And looked at the details of what was a pretty difficult encounter.
A fascinating one, too, though.
Oh, absolutely.
We saw personalities clash, priorities collide.
Right.
And it just goes to show that even in this day and age, personal relationships between leaders can have a huge impact on global events.
Absolutely.
It really brings home the reality of the situation, doesn't it?
It does.
We can talk about strategy and politics, but this is ultimately about people's lives.
Right.
It's about their homes, their country.
And the Ukrainian president, he really brought that home.
He did.
When he showed the U.S. president those photos.
Yeah, those photos of the prisoners of war. It was a way to cut through all the political talk and just show the raw human cost of this war.
But I'm not sure the U.S. president really knew how to respond.
It seemed like he wanted to move on.
He kept bringing the conversation back to that mineral deal.
Exactly.
It almost felt like he was trying to change the subject.
Yeah, and he kept emphasizing his own abilities.
Right.
You know, saying he could get Putin to the table,
Mm-hmm.
make a deal, end the war quickly.
But I imagine for the Ukrainian president, that just sounded like more of the
More
same.
empty promises.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of the wider context.
Right.
The Ukrainian president was very clear.
He was.
He said Europe needs to be united and that the U.S. needs to take the lead.
He's basically saying that this isn't just about Ukraine.
Right.
He said if Putin wins here, he won't stop.
Right.
He even mentioned the Baltic states.
Wow.
Poland.
So he's really appealing to NATO.
He is.
And to the U.S.'s commitment to its allies.
Exactly. He's reminding the U.S. what's at stake.
But of course, the U.S. president has a history here.
He does.
He's questioned NATO's relevance.
Right. And he's always pushing for Europe to spend more on defense.
So there's this tension.
Yeah.
This uncertainty about what the U.S. will actually do.
And it really hangs over the whole conversation.
It does.
Like they're looking at two different futures.
The U.S. president wants a quick win.
He wants a deal he can announce.
Exactly.
Something that makes him look good.
But the Ukrainian president, he needs something more.
He needs security, long-term security.
And those two things, they don't necessarily go together.
Not always, no. It's like the U.S. president sees this as a business deal.
Right. Get the minerals.
Yeah.
Get out, end the war.
But for Ukraine, this is about survival.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's a fundamental difference.
It is, and it's why this meeting felt so strange.
Then you had that comment from the U.S. president.
Oh, yeah?
Telling the Ukrainian president to be more thankful.
It was a power move.
Trying to remind him who was in charge.
Exactly. But the Ukrainian president, he pushed back. Of course. He reminded the U.S. president that it's his people dying in this war.
And the U.S. president just kept interrupting.
Yeah.
talking over him.
It just made everything worse.
It did.
It was disrespectful.
It was.
Like he wasn't really listening. It really makes you think about all those behind-the-scenes conversations we never get to hear.
Yeah, and how much these personalities really matter.
Because at the end of the day, it's still individuals making these big decisions.
Right, and in this case, you really saw that contrast in how they communicate.
You really did. The U.S. president interrupting all the time, focusing on his own accomplishments.
His language, even.
Yeah.
It was so different.
You can't forget the history here either.
Right, all those broken promises.
The deep mistrust of Russia.
Yeah.
The fear of being abandoned by the West.
These are really deep wounds.
They are. For Ukraine, this goes way beyond just territory or resources.
It's about their identity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're fighting for their survival.
Right.
And they need to know who they can count on.
And the fact that this all played out so publicly.
It adds another layer.
It did. It wasn't just a private disagreement.
No, it was a spectacle.
It was.
A display of disunity.
Right. And that could have consequences.
It definitely could. It raises questions about the U.S.'s commitment to its allies.
And their ability to be a leader on the world stage.
Right.
And it makes you wonder, how effective can diplomacy really be?
Yeah.
When you have these kinds of personal tensions.
So much is riding on these personal relationships.
It really is.
Yeah.
So where does that leave us? It all comes down to whether these two leaders can find a way to work together.
And whether they can rebuild that trust.
And that's a big question mark.
It is. Something we'll have to keep watching.
Absolutely. So we've really gone beyond those headlines today. And I think it's given us a much deeper understanding of this conflict.
I think so, too. It shows how complex things really are.
And how much those personal relationships
Yeah.
can impact what happens on the world stage.
Well said.
We hope you found this deep dive helpful.